Today we will look at the appendicular skeleton, and this particular video I will go over the names of the bones and also the markings. Here is a skeleton anterior view, lateral view, and posterior view. We're going to start with the pectoral girdle, which is made up of the clavicle and the scapula. You can see the scapula here and also in the back. The clavicle and scapula articulate with each other. Here we see the clavicle and in the back the scapula. The humerus, which is the bone of the arm in the brachial region. Here is the radius on the thumb side and the ulna on the pinky side. One way of remembering that is you can take a radial pulse in your wrist, and that's really your radial artery. Or another way of remembering it is here's the ulna, and it's on the pinky side, P-U, pinky ulna. The carpals are 8 bones in the wrist or upper hand. There's also metacarpal bones and phalanges, which are the finger bones. Here are the coxal bones, one on each side, attached to the sacrum. This is the femur or the thigh bone, the patella, the tibia, and fibula. You can remember little fib, that's going to be on the lateral side, while tibia is on the medial side. And then there are metatarsals and phalanges. With the thumb, there's only 2 phalanges, and the same thing with the big toe, there's 2 phalanges. The rest of the fingers and toes each have 3 phalanges. Here we see the pectoral girdle, the clavicle, and the scapula. Notice the clavicle articulates with the sternum, and it articulates with the scapula. Here we see the clavicle and the scapula on the skeleton. When we look at the clavicle then, we have 2 ends. This is the end called the sternal end, and then the flattened end articulates with the acromion process on the scapula, so it's called the acromion end. Here is the scapula. This is a posterior view of the scapula, and this is an anterior view. And this is the spine of the scapula. When we look at the scapula in a posterior view, we can see the spine, the glenoid cavity, and the acromion process. So here is a view from the back, the posterior view. Here's the spine. At the end of the spine is the acromion. And on the actual scapula, here is the glenoid cavity. So we just looked at the scapula and the clavicle, and next we're going to go to the humerus bone. Here is the head of the humerus. Also on the lateral side of the humerus is a tuberosity where a muscle attaches. So the deltoid tuberosity is where the deltoid muscle attaches. Here also is a sulcus, or a depression, running between those 2 tubercles, and therefore it's called the intertubercular sulcus. Inter means between the tubercles. There's a sulcus, a depression. The anatomical neck of the humerus is really the epiphyseal line. That is a remnant of the epiphyseal plate. There's also a surgical neck right under the head of the humerus. Here we see the head of the humerus. Here's the greater tubercle. On the lateral side, you also see the deltoid tuberosity. We see a trochlea on the medial side and a capitulum on the lateral side. This is more rounded. Capital, or capit, is referring to head, so it's round like a head would be round. Capitulum. And on the back of the humerus, there's a deep depression called the olecranon fossa. This bone is the ulna, and I always remember this because there's a U-shaped structure on the ulna called the trochlear notch. Ulna has a U shape. It also, at the end, has the olecranon, which is your elbow, and another process called the coronoid process. At the distal end, here's the styloid process. Close-up view of the trochlear notch. The U shape tells us it's the ulna. Here's the olecranon. The coronoid process. This is the radius. The proximal end of the radius is round. This is the head of the radius. The radial tuberosity, remember a tuberosity is where muscles attach, so the biceps brachii muscle attaches here. This is the radial tuberosity. On the distal end, the styloid process of the radius. Here's another view of the proximal end of the radius, the rounded head, and this roughened bump called the radial tuberosity. Finally, we're going to look at the hand. There are 8 carpals altogether. The bones here are the metacarpals, named in order 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, starting on the thumb side, with the metacarpal that articulates with the phalanges of the thumb. There's a proximal phalange and a distal phalange. The rest of these finger bones or phalanges have a proximal, middle, and distal phalange, 3 in each. As a recap, let's look back at the clavicle and the scapula. The humerus that articulates with the glenoid cavity of the scapula. And here's the back of the humerus. You can see the ulna, the olecranon of the ulna fits into that olecranon fossa of the humerus. And the other bone is the radius, which has a wider distal end than the ulna. Here are the carpals and the metacarpals and also the phalanges.